So thank you for joining us. This is our second question and answer session. And as you know, we're a homelessness prevention charity, and we work with agencies all across the town to support people who are homeless at risk of losing their home. And in the run-up to the election in December, the aim of these sessions were to speak to prospective parliamentary candidates in Reading West about some of the key issues that we experience and that have an impact on our clients, and just to ask you how you plan to tackle the housing crisis. So if we kick things off, if you could start telling us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll start with some questions.
Right, well, as I said, I'm a teacher now, but I retrained just after the last general election, so I've only actually been qualified this academic year. I've always worked with children and young people and their families. Initially, I worked in social services, children's homes. I've been a supported lodgings supported lodgings coordinator. So seeing vulnerable young people at 15 to 18 in need of housing, but where it wasn't appropriate for them to go into foster care. So the supported lodgings step was the more natural one for them to go into. From that, I went into education welfare, supporting families and children who for one reason or another weren't managing to attend school. I am extremely proud that in the 6 years that I did that, I never had to actually take a family to court, because as I'm sure you're aware, often the people who are struggling are the people who are least able to pay the fines, and I never saw that as a particularly productive way of dealing with the problem. So I was actually quite proud of my record of always being to work with the families and the schools to prevent court action needing to be taken. After that, with the formation of youth offending teams, I was seconded to work on a youth offending team, which was fantastic. That multi-agency approach to young people's offending was transformative. It really was. It was such an exciting thing to be part of at its formation. I was the education, training and employment specialist on the team, but we had police officers, we had youth workers, if you remember those, and social workers. We had a part-time ed psych, so we were able to get assessments done without having to stand in the queue in CAMS. It was really, really exciting looking at, the young person in a holistic way to look at why has this offending occurred, how can we support this young person to not offend, and some of the time the issue of housing would come up within that, because the young person might be in a housing situation where there's overcrowding, where the house was not of a suitable standard for habitation, and these reasons were compounding or adding to their offending behaviour, and the youth offending team was able to reach into organisations in a way that I don't think had previously been seen. So that was very exciting. Then I had kids, and took some time out to look after my own children rather than other people's, and being a sucker for punishment, have retrained as a secondary school teacher in state schools, which I have to say I'm loving. I've been really, really enjoying being a teacher.
Great. Okay, if we start talking about rough sleeping, so there are an estimated 4,677 people sleeping rough in England, and an annual count of rough sleepers by Reading Borough Council in November last year found 25 people sleeping on the streets in Reading. What do you think is the best approach to preventing homelessness and reducing these numbers?
I think you ask an incredibly complex question, and I think if I attempted to give you a sound bite answer, I would not be doing the question any kind of justice. I think it is to do with all those rough sleeping is to do with all the multifaceted things that are going wrong with our society. The first and foremost thing has to be an immediate right to shelter. Just on the walking here from my car today, my fingers had gone numb by the time I got to your organisation. I can't begin to imagine what it must be like to try and spend a night in the temperatures that we're experiencing. To spend a night sleeping rough on the streets. I think I've only ever done it twice in my life, and that was more through error than because I didn't have a place to stay. It was because I couldn't get to the place that I needed to stay. But I was with people, and I knew I was just sleeping out till the bus service started in the morning. It doesn't compare with knowing that you're going to have to do that sort of night after night. I don't know. So the first thing has to be to provide a safe, warm place for people. But then the complexity comes in sort of how do we turn that into a sense of permanence, because none of us can to bounce from day to day not knowing where you're sleeping that night. Again, I find it very difficult, and I would admit to finding it difficult to make that. I think to pretend I can understand is wrong. I don't know what it's like.
If we move on to private rent prices, so many of our clients are forced into private rented accommodation because of the huge lack of social housing in Reading, but the weekly rent payments for private rented accommodation are well above the housing allowance. So for example, the housing allowance for a room in shared accommodation is £81.14 a week, yet the average rent for a room in Reading is £115 a week. So how do you see yourself resolving this issue?
We've addressed this in our manifesto. I was so relieved to see it when the manifesto came out. We are talking about allowing local housing allowance payments to be increased in relation to costs of living in individual areas. You can't have a standard allowance for the whole country. It's ludicrous. We were talking about inner and outer London waiting. It's a sort of similar concept. You have to have a higher allowance in areas where rents are higher. It's that simple. So yes, that is in our manifesto to do.
When it comes to landlords not accepting benefits, there's a huge barrier our clients face with securing accommodation. Landlords or estate agents rarely accept benefits or the rent guarantee scheme, even when, say for example, our clients have a good track record of paying rent and on time. What does your party plan to do about this, and do you think that is essentially discrimination, that kind of behaviour?
Yes, obviously. It would have to be. But am I right in thinking that the justification for this is given because those landlords no longer, is this to do with them not being sent the money directly anymore?
I don't know, what do our support workers
Sorry, it was
say?
my question.
Yes.
Even when the landlords are promised that it will be directly paid to them, there's still quite a lot of prejudice. And one of the things they're saying, if they've got a buy-to-let mortgage, is that their banks are saying no to the mortgage if they have people on benefits.
Is that true, or is it being used as an excuse?
We
Right,
don't
okay.
know.
Right.
So we only know what the landlords and the estate agents tell us.
Right.
Whether it's true or not,
It's
we
certainly
would never know.
It's certainly been covered in The Guardian in the sense of people who own properties on buy-to-let, are being told you can't accept benefits. Because effectively the government is therefore subsidising the person buying the house, and that's where the problem comes in.
One of the main obstacles we found is that when we move on people to private rented, the landlords and estate agents, they would not accept housing benefit or anyone that is in receipt of benefit.
I said I would be honest with you when I
Yeah.
haven't read up on an area. This is not an area that I have read up on. I am vaguely aware of it because of programmes that I've watched. There was a particularly unpleasant landlord, you know, who was featured, who had hundreds of properties around the country and seemed to regard people on benefits. I mean, this is part of a hostile environment towards people who are at risk of homelessness. I mean, our current Conservative, I mean, Boris Johnson's sort of comments about women, single mothers not sort of being able to manage their money.
Can I just take it further than that?
Yes, please do.
Can I go past hostility just to say that they might be breaking the law with discrimination?
Yeah, I mean, has your organisation, because are you part of wider homelessness sort of bodies? Do you work together across the country?
Yeah, there is this thing called Homeless Link, which we're members of, which covers the entire country.
Has there been a challenge?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, it's ongoing. It's an ongoing
Right, okay.
situation and talk and chats, but I think the problem is that takes quite some time to have talks and chats, and in the meantime there's people being discriminated against.
Yes.
And it's housing, which is a very basic human
Absolutely.
need.
Yes.
And it's not a
Absolutely.
new thing either, it's been going on for a long time.
Yes, I mean, when I was reading up before meeting you, I did come across a lot of landlords' websites that they were analysing the party's manifestos, which is how I kind of stumbled upon them, and they certainly don't seem to like ours, which possibly means we're sort of maybe heading in the right direction with the sort of the rental market. What you're saying disturbs me hugely. Sadly, it doesn't surprise me, but I will look into it. And if you give me your email address, we have at the moment open to us a candidates portal that we can send emails into on very specific issues, and they get back to us. So I would be more than, in fact, I'd be very interested myself to know whether this is on our radar, and if so, whereabouts on the radar it is.
We see many landlords letting properties in substandard or unsafe conditions, yet they still charge high rates. Are there any plans to tackle this?
Yes, we have. I am going to have to whip through, but I was looking at this last night. Here we go. Okay. Standards. Oh. Sorry, the trouble with the Lib Dems producing a 100-page manifesto is that there is 100 darn pages of it.
Can I summarise the question?
Yes.
There was a bill put before Parliament to that all homes must be habitable.
Oh yes.
Would you support that?
Absolutely.
That was rejected. So would you support the idea that all homes must be habitable?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, the worst accommodation that I've ever lived in, and I lived in London for 3 years, in East London, in a squat. Now, I was lucky. I had a key to the door. I'm not complaining about it. I had a key to the door, and we were hooked up to electricity. So, you know, it was secure and safe accommodation. But in normal standards, it would not have been habitable. You know, there were you could see ceiling beams, and there were floorboards missing, cables that were exposed, but it was all that I couldn't afford to live and study in London. Even back in the early 90s, it was outside the realms of. When I went to university, I had no wealthy parents backing me. It was impossible to survive. I had to do a runner on at the end of my first term because I couldn't pay the last few weeks' rent, I assuage my own guilt with that by knowing that they kept my deposit. So I really hope they don't listen in on this. I still feel guilty about that. But yes, that house, it was fine for me as a 20-something who was fit and knew that I was at university to get a better job and to, you know, sort of. I also knew my mum was back at home in Reading, and, you know, whenever I needed clothes washing or to raid someone's fridge, it was there. So I'm not complaining about the situation, but yes, I would not, having been a mother, expect any family to live in that kind of accommodation. There have to be absolutely basic standards, and they have to be checked. So I know one of the things we want to introduce is a mandatory register of all landlords, and we would want to see local authorities funded to be able to properly inspect those properties, and you take away their licences if they don't. Yeah, that should be an easy win for any party, I would have thought. I would hope very much that whoever you ask that question of is going to sit here and say something very, very similar, because that seems to be an easy win.
Okay. Section 21. So over the summer there's been a consultation process on the abolition of Section 21, so no fault evictions. What is the Lib Dem's stance on no fault evictions, and what does your party plan to do about them if you get into power?
We would abolish Section 21 no fault evictions. We want to encourage longer tenancies to give people more security, and abolish them.
Okay.
Stop them.
Do you think right to buy should be abolished?
Right to buy. That's an interesting one. I know that we are looking at a scheme of rent to own, where you go into social housing, and the longer you stay there, the more money you pay into that property in rent. After a 30-year period, you would own the property. Right to buy, it could have worked if we'd replaced housing stock as it was being removed. We didn't. I mean, I say we. The Tories didn't. I mean, that's what should have happened from the moment Margaret Thatcher introduced the scheme. So you know, we can't just keep selling off every single council house. You know, I am perfectly happy with those people who have done well for themselves and managed to buy their council home. I don't have a problem with those individuals. What I have a problem with is a system where all of that money went straight into central government and didn't go into home building. That it was catastrophic. And so now we do need to build properties and not immediately sell them off, only to see them sort of coming back onto the market a few years later.
So that leads me on to my last question. So there are 4,710 applications in Reading on the waiting list for social housing. Do you plan to build more social housing?
The figures alone say we have to. We have to. And I know every party at the moment is promising, quite rightly, ambitious house building. What worries me is that it seems like after each election, I worry that in 2 years' time, I'll be sitting back here in front of you for another general election, and, you know, the 100,000 my party promise won't have been built, and however hundreds of thousands the Labour Party won't have been built. And so yes, I mean, we will build more here, but I do worry that the levels of politicians above me make these promises and actually don't turn it into action. Reading has a particular problem because, of course, we've built to our boundaries. You only need to look at a map of Reading to see that all of the big house building is taking place on the Oxfordshire borders, the West Berks borders, the Wokingham borders. We have no land. So unless we're going to look at changing boundaries, or unless there is a way in which Reading Borough Council can build on Oxfordshire land. This is a slightly unique problem with Reading. I do like the current policy that the council are taking of buying up properties as they come onto the market and acting as landlord and using those properties as social housing. I think that is super. I'd like to see it accelerated. I'd like to see it expanded, because it does, I think, if we could enlarge it enough, it would take some of the heat out of the rental sector prices, because Reading Borough Council would be able to sort of set the rent and, you know, start bringing down housing prices. But yes, we have to build more. I don't know if we go up. What do you think? I'm just curious whether anyone has any thoughts about the physical building of properties in Reading.
Yeah.
Well, I'm most concerned about the quality of what's being built.
Okay.
And I just wonder whether you will reinstate the regulations which were relaxed or completely cancelled
On size.
in the Thatcher times. Not only the minimum size, but also the insulation and that sort of thing. I think the sort of stuff that's being built at the moment is just going to lead to massive social problems.
I think you make a really good point. Yeah.
People are just living on top of one another. They can hear life going on next door, and it's just going to be disastrous. It probably already is.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point there, yes, just building houses isn't enough. I mean, I know that our ambition, if we were in a position to influence power, would be to build all new homes to a zero carbon standard. Climate change is, whatever Donald Trump says, it's happening, okay, and the two should go hand in hand. You know, we can help individuals, we can help the homeless situation, but we also want to make, this is the thing about the complexity of the world that we're living in. If we can make those homes carbon neutral, then that's, the people who live in them are going to save huge amounts of money on bills. So straight away, you've given them an advantage. So you're helping the poorest to keep what money they have and not have to waste it through single pane windows where, you know, they suck the heat out every night. But we're also doing our bit for climate change as well. We would also be looking at a 10-year programme to cut fuel bills by retrofitting properties, and amongst those would be the rented accommodation would be pretty much front of the line. The idea would be that you start retrofitting the poorest housing stock first, and I mean, my mum's got a quite nice house in Caversham, not the Heights, but it's Victorian built, and they're single skin walls. My mum, unfortunately, would be at the end of the list, because actually she's, you know, reasonably comfortable in her retirement, and we need it to be the people at the lower end of the queue who get that retrofitting first. But that would be the idea, a 10-year programme of trying to bring all houses up to reduce their carbon footprint, but as I say, to save money.
And minimum size as
I
well?
don't know, but you're right. You're absolutely right.
It's the Park and Morris standards, which were abolished in 1979.
Yeah, that's another one that I'll
Thank
have to
you.
go away and look at, because, just my younger sister married a German, and when we go over and visit, the floor space on an average house, not a posh house, a totally average house, is absolutely astounding. It's, they give you space, and it's like, how can you afford this space? Well, space isn't expensive, is the response from, her German husband. And yet over here, you're right, they have been getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and it's something that would come up in my work as an education welfare officer. You know, when a child's missing school because they haven't done their homework, well, why haven't they done their homework? Because them and 3 younger siblings are squeezed into this tiny little space. There's not room for a desk, you know, there's not room for them to have quiet in the houses. So you're right, I don't know the answer. I am happy to look into it and find out where we stand on that, because if it's not something we're looking at, it shouldn't be.
Should we see if the audience have any other questions? Anyone? Anita?
Jo Swinson recently admitted that the Lib Dems didn't get everything right in the Tory-led coalition in 2013. Presumably this extends to the most divisive policy at the time, the bedroom tax policy. How do you plan to set things right in regards to bedroom tax, as it affects many of my clients that I see as a legal aid housing solicitor facing possession proceedings?
The instant that policy came in, I was dealing with residents, you know, in Tilehurst, who were being negatively affected by it. I mean, I know myself and other sort of Lib Dem councillors at the time basically inundated our MPs with evidence that this was not working. I mean, it doesn't make any difference now. But at the time we did try to amend it. When the evidence came in, we did try to amend it, but unfortunately the Labour Party did not support that, because what we wanted to do was only, the amendment would have meant that you could only you would only be charged if you had refused appropriate alternative accommodation, with the emphasis being on appropriate, so in the same area and being of a suitable quality and standard. So if you had refused that, I mean, what we know is that there just aren't places to downsize to. They don't exist. And particularly if you want to stay within your community, which is right and proper and everyone should be able to. So we would get rid of that. We are happy to hold our hands up in the light of evidence when it comes in, and change tack on it. I'm not quite sure why in modern politics all of the political parties seem to regard actually looking at evidence and going, we got this wrong, as I'm happy to say we looked at evidence and we got it wrong, and it will be scrapped.
I was just wondering what Liberals' view would be on the shoddy state of some of our house offices and high-rise flats, like the Grenfell Tower cladding issue. Would they support the idea of all of that being removed? You know.
I mean, because the cladding in Reading hasn't been a major issue. I know Reading Borough Council quite rightly and very appropriately responded straight away and inspected the cladding on Reading Borough Council buildings to reassure residents. Because of that, I haven't really looked into it outside of our local area. I mean, you know what happened at Grenfell, it goes without saying, you know, was absolutely appalling. And I am very glad that I am not part of the council that made that cost-cutting saving of a few £1,000s from the slightly more expensive cladding that would not have transported the fire across the building the way that it did. I'm not quite sure how those councillors sleep at night. It's a guess. But there have to be standards where we know that something works, where something is prevented, then we need to implement it. I don't know if this is down to the cuts in local government budgets. You know, the local government is not receiving funding from central government. We're expected to sort of do everything that we do out of council tax sort of revenues, and that there is so little money to spare. Having said that, I don't my understanding, without being an expert on it, is that the local authority that Grenfell's in actually possibly didn't need to worry about the money the same way that perhaps Reading Borough Council need to worry about. Yes, so I don't know if that argument holds for them, which is why,
Any other questions?
Change the subject slightly. In
Yeah.
terms of drugs, as you know, in terms of if you wander around the streets of Reading, in terms of you can buy crack cocaine in the centre of town, heroin, cannabis. I walk to work and the smell of cannabis kind of wafts out most places, lots of places. My personal view would be, in terms of the long war against drugs is lost.
it is.
That we really need to decriminalise drugs. What is the Liberal Party view on this?
We are the party that is completely clear on this. We want an evidence-based approach, and we do want to decriminalise drug use. I have received stick for this, but I am not ashamed of our policy on this. It's even before I got involved in local politics, I knew people who had, because of circumstances, errors, gotten involved with hard drugs. If you are taking heroin, this is not a lifestyle choice. Okay, nobody wakes up in the morning and thinks, hey, this would be a great way to live my life. Yeah, you fall into these things, and once these drugs have a grip on you, it's not a lack of moral fibre that stops you getting off of heroin. You are addicted to one of the most powerful substances known to man. Okay, to me, we need to move these things out of the criminal justice system and into the health and social support system. It's that simple. Let's stop punishing people for something that they have gotten themselves caught up in and need help to get out of. Should it ever happen to me? Should it happen to my children? Yeah, I don't want them being sent to jail where there's even more drugs. Yeah, I would want them to be able to access the support and services without being treated as if they are scum, without being looked down upon by services. So no, yes, absolutely. We need to decriminalise drugs. We need to take it out of the realm of the criminal justice system. And I think we would see drug usage go down. I think we would see drug deaths go down. I mean, my dad told me that in the 1970s, he was working for a computer company, and he was, working his way up the career ladder, youngish. Me and my sister would have been very small at the time. And one of the guys he worked with was a registered heroin user. Okay. Now this guy had his own home. Okay. He had a wife. He had kids. I don't know what had led him to become addicted to heroin, but twice a day, he was able to go to a nurse, and he would be given heroin on the NHS. It was available on the NHS until Margaret Thatcher stopped that. And because of that, he was a functioning member of society. Okay, he held down a job. He had a wife and kids who were living with him in his home, and he wasn't committing any crime. He was, to me, that makes far more sense, both economically and socially, than to keep punishing these people for an addiction that they need medical support with. I've known mums who have lost their children because of substance misuse, and they are good mums who love their children, but they are having to spend most of the day getting a fix to feel normal, to be able to function. If, like this gentleman sort of in the 1970s that my father knew, they were able to go and get heroin on the NHS in a safe environment that took away the clucking and the twitching, and then they can go home and cook dinner for their kids, and then they can help them with their homework. Okay, and with that contact with nurses, they would also be in contact with support services who could start to work on dealing with whatever issues that had led them to start abusing substances and to help them alter their lives. So, does that answer it?
Very well.
James?
So here at Launchpad, the story doesn't end when we get someone housed or provide a home for someone. We're also looking at rehabilitating people, reconnecting them with the community, which you've quite rightly discussed. So I'd like to ask, what are your plans to deal with casualisation and work and the impacts of automation in future job losses? And what are your plans for high streets and town centres?
That's a good question. It's a big question. I think I probably need to chop that down. I haven't really thought about automation. I mean, interestingly enough, a couple of days ago, I got an email. I haven't had time to actually respond to it. So I'm going to throw back a question at you as a result of it, because a group of Lib Dem parliamentary candidates were talking about the idea of a universal income. And there's certainly a strong group within the Lib Dems that are pushing for at least a trial of the universal income. And I was reading through it and thinking, this is really, really interesting. But as I say, I haven't had time to actually delve down and research into it. Do you think that is the kind of thing that could solve the issue of ultimatum, so it would sort of take the pressure off of people maybe while they reskill or retrain?
I think it would be beneficial. And just contrasting that with Labour's policy, which we heard about last week, which would be to offer 6 years worth of training to people midlife.
Again, I know that we have, we would like to have this skills passport that you can use throughout life. I mean, lifelong learning is something that I care quite passionately about, because I've taken advantage of it. I mean, I couldn't have retrained as a teacher unless there had been the funding there for me to do so. Let's face it, as an education welfare officer, I saw a lot of young people who, at that point in their life, were not ready to engage with education. The situations in their families, in their social groups were they were more intense than the need to get qualifications at that stage. And you know, those people often in their 20s, 30s, perhaps when they first have children, suddenly realise that they want to learn, they want to actually upskill themselves, and we have to have that available to them. I'm just trying to see if I've brought along details of the funding that we've stuck behind it. I don't know if I've got those details on me. I can send them to you, but yes, we're looking at a sort of I don't like the term that we've chosen, this idea of a skills wallet, so that you have an amount of money that you can access and use throughout your life to do courses and training.
But it's pretty dramatic though, isn't it? When you look at some of the studies that have been done, they talk about robotics affecting over 30% of people in current low-skilled jobs.
Yes. I mean, it is a worry. You know, I'm teaching young people, and I personally think they're all sort of bright, wonderful people that are, as individuals, just full of potential. But some of them will do better in the exam system than others, and I worry about the ones, you know, who don't manage to squeeze themselves into the hole that society's trying to force them into. I mean, when I was younger, there seemed to be a lot more kudos attached to things like apprenticeships, to alternative jobs. Now we seem to have stuck a degree onto almost everything, and I'm not convinced that is the way of equaling society. I mean, I for one will pay damn good money, and I do, for carpenters, electricians, plumbers, because I look at a broken washing machine and want to cry. If the kicking it doesn't work, I've got nothing. You know, there are people who have trained in a skill that I don't have, that for me is incredibly valuable, and I will pay them to come out and fix my washing machine. I will pay them to be able to run the electricity through my house. These skills, these talents, you know, we need to put them on a parity with the traditional educational routes to success.
Has anybody got any other questions?
Just to continue my previous question, what are your plans for town centres and high streets?
Yeah, that's a worry. I don't know how we challenge the growth of online shopping, because everybody does it. You know,
Would you implement the tax on Google, Amazon and people like this?
Oh, I think it's a super idea. I haven't actually read where our party stands on it, but as an individual, yes, you know, because they do have such a massive advantage over shops with frontages. I think the diversification on the high street, and I think Reading isn't doing bad at it, where it becomes more of a day out, and things like the Abbey Quarter, if we can manage to purchase Reading Jail and develop that into sort of an arts community centre kind of hub, all of these things will make Reading a bit more of a day out, which I think will help high streets. But yeah, I do think that it is a concern, because if we lose our high streets, we lose the heart of the community. Did I answer all of that, or just a bit of it?
I think
throw it back to me if I didn't.
It's fine.
Okay. Right.
Any other questions? No? Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you all for making us as parliamentary candidates have to read up on this. I mean, last night I was up till about 10 o'clock teaching myself about, and you didn't ask me about the where is it? Vagrancy Act. The 1852 Vagrancy Act. I was making notes on it, and by the way, we plan on getting rid of it. But yeah, thank you for making us look into these things. When prepping for this, it made me think about all the different experiences that I've had, you know, throughout my life, my working life, my personal life, because I haven't thought about that squat in years. And yes, that was a fun adventure for a 20-year-old at university. But if I was doing it now with my 3 kids, somehow I don't reckon that would be such a fun adventure. All of the people that I know, that my kids went to primary school with, that had to spend months in B&Bs. I know a woman who, she spent over a year in a B&B in Slough, and she still managed to get her children over to Moorlands Primary School every single school day. All right, she missed a few of them, okay, but she got no help with the funding. I never asked her if she had to jump the barriers. I would think, don't tell me anything, Lala. But you know, the commitment she had to her children's education, and to be forced to do that, and along the way she could have, and she knew it, if she'd gone for private rented, yeah, then, you know, she could have had her children in accommodation quicker, but she also knew if she went for private rented, she could be Section 21'd, there was no security to it, there was no safety. And I admire her so damn much for hanging in there. And she now has her council place, and it is just one road away from where her mum and her family live. But nobody should have to go through that, nobody. It's just wrong. So thank you for reminding me of all of those things, and thank you for making me think about them during the election period. So well done to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Daisy.